Dreaming of a better sleep? Tossing and turning is not your destiny. And Ollie is here to help. Ollie invites you to sink into sweet, sweet slumber to improve your mental and physical health and overall wellness. More than just melatonin, Ollie's ingredients help you unwind your mind for a delightfully dreamy drift off. Sleep is on the way at Ollie.com. That's OLLY.com.
Hi, reader. I'm Cindy Burnett. Welcome to my award-winning podcast, Thoughts from a Page, which is a member of the Evergreen Podcasts Network. On the show, I chat with authors whose books I have enjoyed about their new releases, and I give you a peek behind the curtain of the publishing industry with my behind-the-scenes series. With so many books coming out weekly, it can be hard to decide what to read, so I find the best ones and share them with you. If you're looking for a community of readers, bonus content, and a chance to read books before they hit the shelves, I hope you'll consider joining my Patreon group, which is filled with a wonderful bunch of book lovers. The link to join is in the show notes. Today, I am chatting with Allison Pataki about Finding Margaret Fuller. This book is the perfect example of why I love historical fiction so much. I knew absolutely nothing about Margaret Fuller before I read Allison's book, and now I feel like I am completely informed about a woman who everyone should know about. She lived 3 lifetimes in her short 40 years, and I hope you love learning about her as much as I did. Allison is the New York Times bestselling author of numerous novels. Her books have been translated into more than 20 languages. She is a former news writer and producer and has written for the New York Times, ABC News, HuffPost, USA Today, and more. Allison graduated cum laude from Yale University, is a member of the Historical Novel Society, and lives in New York with her husband and family. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
Are you tired of seeing your teen or young adult struggle on a path that clearly isn't the right fit? Is your teenager confused about which direction to take after high school? The future of work is changing rapidly, and our kids need to know all of the options available after high school so they're empowered to make the choice that is best for them. In each episode, we explore the latest trends that are shaping the opportunities of today and tomorrow. I'm your host, Betsy Jewell, and this is the High School Hamster Wheel Podcast.
Welcome, Allison. How are you today?
Thank you for having me. I'm great. Happy to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. We have not chatted before, so I'm really looking forward to this.
Absolutely.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed Finding Margaret Fuller. I did not even know who Margaret Fuller was, and I feel like I don't know how I didn't know who she was, because she literally encountered so many people in her decently short life. So I can't wait to hear so much about your book and how you decided to write it and everything.
Absolutely. I love starting from that place. So thank you. I love starting from the place of a reader saying, A, I hadn't heard her name before, and B, how is it possible that I hadn't heard her name before? Because that is generally the place from where I begin my process as the writer as well. And this wonderful experience of discovery, thinking, oh my goodness, this woman lived. This woman not only witnessed history, but had an active hand in shaping it and participating in it. And I just want to read a book about her. And if there isn't a book about her, then that's the book I want to write. And so that's sort of how it's happened for me organically every time as well. And I had the same exact experience when I encountered Margaret Fuller in the pages of nonfiction when I first decided, oh my goodness, that's my next woman. That's the next woman I've got to write about.
And I was so glad you included that in your author's note, because I am always so intrigued, particularly with people like this, a name that I don't know, that you didn't know, to wonder, how did you even encounter her? So before we go into all of that, will you just give me a quick synopsis of the book, and then we can dive into all these fun questions?
Yes, absolutely. So Finding Margaret Fuller is my 10th book. It is a work of historical fiction inspired by the true life of Margaret Fuller, who was described by Ralph Waldo Emerson as the radiant genius and fiery heart at the center of their genius cluster, this group of great thinkers and artists that gave us much of the American canon of art and literature. So you have this group living in Concord, Massachusetts in the mid-19th century that includes Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Thoreau, Louisa May Alcott, Herman Melville, Margaret Fuller is the most interesting, most fascinating, most captivating figure of all of these contemporaries and friends and colleagues. And yet her name is the least well known. So my story follows her life, follows her adventures, follows her trailblazing kind of iconoclastic journey, her love affairs, and ultimately goes into the story behind the story of this great moment in time with these artists, with Margaret Fuller as our leading lady and our way into the story.
So you touched on this a minute ago, but tell me a little bit more and tell the listeners how you first discovered her.
Absolutely. So I love writing historical fiction about strong women from history who have been sort of sidelined. And I love pulling these women from the footnotes and the shadows of the historical record to put them center stage and to build these novels around their lives and their impact. And so 3 years ago, I had family visiting from out of town. I had actually just given birth to my third daughter, and it was Memorial Day weekend, and we had all these grand plans to enjoy summer, and it absolutely rained the entire weekend. It was a downpour. We were inside. We were all going cabin fever stir crazy. And my mother-in-law just gave me this great book recommendation. It was called American Bloomsbury, and it was the nonfiction story of this genius cluster of the Transcendentalists. And it followed the lives of some of these titans and these giants I just mentioned a moment ago: Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, Alcott. And Margaret Fuller was also one of the main subjects of this book. And she leapt off the page for me. I couldn't believe I had not heard her name. She, to me, had by far the most interesting story. And I just felt like every American school child grows up reading the work of all of these giants, except nobody learns the name Margaret Fuller. And I just thought, I need to learn more about this woman, and I need to learn more about her life. And so I became obsessed. I will say it to my husband, like, oh, I found my next book. And usually it's this character that jumps out at me from history. And I say, I've been bitten. I've been bitten. I get the bug. And that's really how it happened with Margaret Fuller. She just captivated me from the start, and I knew I had to write about her.
Well, I'd love to hear about your research. I've always wanted to go to Concord and walk in the footsteps of all of these very famous people that you've mentioned. And I think that would just be so cool. And it's clearly bumped up the list for me after reading your book. But was it just amazing to go there, because I know you did from your author's note, and walk in their footsteps, but also to learn more about each of them, and then particularly Margaret?
Cindy, it is so worth going. You have to go. And it's wonderful all year, but go when the world is in bloom, because as Emerson said there, he was one of the first residents of Concord, one of the first citizens, favorite citizens there. He said, the world laughs in flowers. And when you go to Concord, these writers and thinkers, they were transcendentalists. They were looking for ways to transcend the physical body, spiritual experiences, rapturous experiences. And really, you can see when you go to Concord how they found it in nature, and they found it in the woods and the pastures and the creeks and the seasons. So yes, absolutely, you must go to Concord. Margaret said that when she would roll up to Concord from her life journeys to New York City and Boston, and she traveled as far as Rome, and she traveled the world, she said that she would enter Concord and it would be this paradise of thought, because they had this clique there where they were inspiring one another. They were competing with one another. They were writing and thinking and debating and coming up with new philosophies for this really young American nation, this new democracy where everything was new and fresh and exciting. And they were the boldest thinkers of them all. And so Concord was where I started. Absolutely. As you said, I walked the footsteps. You had the Hawthornes as newlyweds living right next to Emerson, who was right next door to Louisa May Alcott and her family. If you've ever read Little Women, you know Orchard House, the beloved Alcott home. And then you had Thoreau living upstairs in Emerson's house as the handyman before moving out to Walden Pond, which was also Emerson's property. And so you really just think, oh my goodness, all these people were in the same place and the same time, inspiring each other to work and to do better and to think bigger and bolder. But what I felt when I visited Concord is the gang's all here except Margaret. It's a town that has kind of forgotten Margaret Fuller. They're all buried right next to each other. in the cemetery in Concord. Margaret's not there. And if you read my book, you'll see why. You know, every hotel has a suite named for each one of these thinkers, but not Margaret. You go to Emerson's house where Margaret spent some of the best times of her life in his famous guest room downstairs, right across from his office. Very scandalous. Her bedroom is the gift shop. So I just kind of get the sense that everybody there is celebrated, but not Margaret to the extent that she should be. So that's a big theme of my book, is that Margaret loved these people. They were her colleagues, contemporaries, friends, tormentors, cheerleaders. But she was also always kind of an outsider. And when you read the book, you'll see why, and you'll see how that informs some of her boldest decisions. And thank goodness she was an outsider. Thank goodness she did seek ever wider and further horizons.
It was definitely a launch pad for her, because you talk about this group who are, so famous, and she was definitely a part of that. But then she goes on to encounter so many other people that are very important that we know. And I just thought it is just amazing to me. This woman touched on so many different people and careers, because she really does vary it up as to what she does. And then her traveling, you mentioned that. To be a single woman at that time period, all of the places she traveled was mind-boggling to me.
She did a lot of things that pushed the envelope, and she wasn't afraid to be a bit scandalous and traveling alone like that. And then what she gets up to when she's in Rome, talk about an international scandal. But she was this bold, brave, defiant woman who defied conventions time and again. And so Concord became a little bit too small, a little bit too idyllic. She made the pun that Concord was lacking in discord. And so she went to New York City. She sought a bigger canvas. She was recruited by the idealistic, radical thinking Horace Greeley to come and work for his newspaper. And while she was in New York, she wanted more than just poetry. She wanted more than just esoteric philosophy. She wanted to get her hands dirty in the work of actually moving humanity forward and fighting for women and fighting for the female right to vote and fighting for the rights of Black people and speaking out, as an early voice really on so many causes and movements for this new democratic United States of America. And so she moves to New York and she's covering the work of Frederick Douglass and covering art and music and visiting the 5 Point slums and visiting orphanages and hospitals and penitentiaries. She would get into these famous verbal sparring matches with Edgar Allan Poe in some of the New York glitterati literary scenes and salons. And Edgar Allan Poe and she were real rivals. And he said, humanity is divided into men, women, and Margaret Fuller. And that was a begrudging sort of compliment, because even Edgar Allan Poe, as critical as he was of Margaret Fuller, he had to concede that she was brilliant and quite a unique individual.
Didn't reading about these people make you want to time travel, even just to be a fly on the wall, to see them all gathered in these various places?
It really did. Wouldn't you just love to be at a dinner party with Margaret and some of her contemporaries like Walt Whitman, like Frédéric Chopin, like George Sand, Emerson and Alcott and Hawthorne? It's just really, it's kind of mind-boggling to think that they were all living together and working together and just laying down the tracks of what would become American culture and the American canon.
Absolutely. I just kept thinking that over and over again. To be able to go back and see them all interacting together would just be phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Margaret would have been holding court. Margaret always liked to be the most interesting person at the table.
And she seemed like she was. And she had that salon where she encountered Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Horace Greeley's wife.
Absolutely. I think that was a really big turning point for Margaret. Men at the time were allowed to speak in public and host lectures. And Emerson made quite a good living on the lecture circuit. Women were not allowed to speak in public and make money for it. So Margaret said, hey, women are denied the right to go to so many of these colleges. She as a girl would stand outside of Harvard and debate with the Harvard boys, but she wasn't allowed to learn and study at Harvard. And so she thought these women in Boston, New York City, and beyond are raised to become debutantes and then brides. She thought they need so much more. They deserve so much better. A woman's education should be so much more than simply what she learns in order to just become a wife. And so Margaret Fuller wanted to host this series of conversations for women where they read and they wrote and they debated, and they didn't always have to agree. But that part of the fun of it was this discourse, this debate style. She didn't want to just give lectures where she spoke. She was highly educated because her father had seen to it, but she wanted other women to also feel empowered and educated. So she hosted this series of conversations, and that was a real turning point for her because she made money. The series was wildly popular. It had multiple iterations because the women who attended just loved it. That it was there that she became an early mentor and inspiration to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And eventually you'll see what goes on. Margaret becomes the first woman admitted to study at Harvard. She's admitted entry into the Harvard Library to study while she's writing her book. But Margaret really felt so strongly about educating girls and young women, and just knowing that until women had the power to use their own minds and speak up for themselves, they were never going to be anything other than second-class citizens. And so that was really one of the causes closest to her heart, was getting those opportunities for women to seek out learning and education and anything that would expand a woman's world and horizon and opportunities and therefore freedoms.
First, can you imagine living in a world where you were not allowed to be paid to speak, or really even to speak in a large group like that? That was so crazy to me. It's really hard to imagine.
Yeah. And it's really like, Margaret was living in America in the 19th century, and she was just pointing out to people that we have some work to do on multiple fronts before we are fully living into the American promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all.
Definitely. And then second, I loved the part where she shows up at Harvard and all of these men are just totally flummoxed and they don't know what to do. And they are appalled that she is there. And she just keeps coming back until eventually it becomes a little more normal for them.
Exactly. And nobody worked harder than Margaret. And nobody deserved to be there more. So I liked that moment in her life so much, where she not only fights to get herself the rights to study at Harvard, but then she really fights for her place there, and everybody comes to see how deserving and worthy she is.
Absolutely. Did you struggle as you did all of this research and you learned one cool detail after another to figure out what to put in the book and what not to put in the book? Because I can imagine it could have been much longer.
That is always the blessing and the curse for the writer of historical fiction. You land on this raw material from the historical record that's just so good you couldn't make it up. And that's a gift. But then you have to wrangle the historical detail and make it a novel. I'm writing a book. I want this to be an immersive, absorbing reading experience. I can't just dump a bunch of information like bullet points strung together. It has to be a story and a narrative with an arc and the character's development. And so that's always the negotiation. And it's different with each book, obviously, because you're handed different raw material from the history. In this case, I would have been crazy not to stick closely to the historical record. I didn't need to embellish anything or exaggerate anything because the raw material was just so good. So I sort of see it as the raw material from the history is the bones, the skeleton upon which I build the story. And then what I get to do as the writer of historical fiction is go in and add on the flesh and write the scenes and write the dialogue and build these characters and take the reader in as an eyewitness to these moments. And that's why I love historical fiction so much as a reader too. I just love having the opportunity to enter into history and witness these incredible moments that are happening.
Absolutely. I always say that's my favorite thing about historical fiction is learning about all of these people like Margaret Fuller, Frances Perkins with Stephanie Dre's book coming out. There's a variety of women that somehow I've not encountered before, but you're reading this really engaging story at the same time, and it's not dry nonfiction. Not that nonfiction's always dry. Plenty of times it's not. But I love being immersed in a story as well.
Exactly. I say my goal with historical fiction is to educate and entertain. So as you said, sometimes historical fiction might seem a bit daunting to people to pick up a dry, long biography, but historical fiction is maybe perhaps a very satisfying way into the history as well.
Exactly. You've done it a number of times now, But do you find it at all overwhelming sometimes to write about real people?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, especially Margaret Fuller, because one of her contemporaries said that he could read Dante in the original Italian, Hegel in the original German, but he was still working on Margaret Fuller in the original English. And that just to me was so funny because, yes, she was a force. She was a giant. There is no way to ever presume for me to be as brilliant as her. You know, she was like speaking Greek and reading Shakespeare at the age of 5. Okay. I'm not going to ever reach Margaret Fuller levels of brain power. So yes, it's absolutely intimidating. And what I really wanted to capture and present to the reader was the emotional truths of her story. Yes, she wrote these wonderful books, but I also thought that her life story was the most worthy story of all, and that people don't necessarily know how she lived as a woman, how she was as, a thinker, a traveler, a mother, a wife. She participated in the Roman Revolution. She took, this wonderful Roman count as a lover. There was just her story had all the makings of this epic saga. And so I did find it intimidating, but I also just found like the raw material of history was just so good for a dramatic novel. And so, yes, I approach it with a sense of being honored and also humbled and wanting to do her story justice because she was a woman for whom I just have such a deep admiration.
That makes perfect sense. And yes, we hadn't even talked about Italy. I mean, I literally feel like for the amount of time that she lived several lives.
Exactly. Exactly.
Science, science, science! Science, science! Hello, podcast fans. Want to get weird with us? Come check out the Mad Scientist Podcast. We're a weekly show that looks at the history, philosophy, and hard facts behind your biggest paranormal questions.
Did the government really pay for a psychic spy program?
Yes!
Is it true that surgery got its start in grave robbing?
Yes!
Can a roller coaster really kill you?
Legally, we can't say so for sure, but sometimes, yes! Join myself, Chris Cogswell, and my co-host, Marie Mayhew, as we examine the science, philosophy, and history behind the strange and unusual. All to discover what's possible and plausible versus what's, well, just made up. Check us out wherever you find your favorite podcasts. The Mad Scientist Podcast.
I'm Allison Holland, host of the Kennedy Dynasty Podcast. Equipped with a microphone and a long-term fascination of the Kennedy family, I am joined by an incredible cast of experts, friends, and guests to take you on a fun, relaxed, yet informative journey through history and pop culture. From book references to fashion to philanthropy to our modern expectations of the presidency itself, you'll see that there is so much more to Kennedy than just JFK or conspiracy theories. Join me for the Kennedy Dynasty Podcast.
Well, what surprised you the most when you were writing this one?
Probably just my feelings of, I guess, regret over how much more she could have done. I'm not going to spoil the ending for readers who have not finished the book yet, but when you see how much she accomplished and the extent of her legacy, and then you just look at the time in history in which she was living, where you've got the Civil War coming up, you've got the women's suffrage movement coming up, I just felt this incredible sense of, oh, what could she have done had that not ended the way it ended? And so I guess just the extent of her legacy, how powerful it was, how much she managed to squeeze into her life, coupled with this loss of this life that happened far too young.
Most definitely. That was the thing that struck me. And again, I don't want to spoil it either, but was that there was so much more she could have done and would have done.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
What about a highlight? Did you have a highlight of writing the book?
I loved writing about Margaret's time in New York City and this sort of unlikely friendship she had with Horace Greeley and the members of the Greeley family, his young son, his wife. They lived in Turtle Bay, overlooking the river. She was covering everything from Frederick Douglass to Beethoven to Karl Marx. And this was really a turning point, I think, in her life where Margaret came to realize she could dream bigger. And then she accepts this assignment from Horace Greeley to become the first foreign female correspondent. And she takes this opportunity for adventure and moves to Europe by herself, mingles with Wordsworth in England, George Sand and Frédéric Chopin in Paris, and then really how she finds the place where she is meant to be when she arrives in Rome. I loved that bit where she's really becoming her own woman. She is stepping into her power. She's drawing life on a larger canvas, and really remarkable things happen for her.
So there's this wonderful expression that her dad used about her that then trails throughout the book, is kind of woven in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So Margaret Fuller's father called her the much that always wanted more. And he really educated her, his eldest daughter, as though she were a son. He was drilling her in Greek and Latin, basically as a toddler. He wouldn't let her read Shakespeare because he thought it was beneath her, as a child, mind you.
I love that. I was going to mention that in a second because I was cracking up that he felt that that was not good enough for her.
Yes, and that's actually true. And so there was this interesting dynamic where he fed her brilliance, he encouraged her brilliance, he expected her brilliance. He was really exigent and exacting. And yet at the same time, the Fullers, being this upper crust, New England, Massachusetts, blue-blooded family, they saw that their daughter was so bright and so educated and so bold that she was probably going to intimidate any man who would want to marry her. And so there was this weird dilemma where they knew she was brilliant. They pushed her brilliance. They expected brilliance from her. And yet she was always too much. She wanted too much as a woman, and she expected too much, and she spoke her mind and, out debated the men. And so, as you can imagine, this made Margaret feel very much an outcast. What was her place? She didn't want to be a wife if it just meant making a society match and forfeiting all of her agency to a man. She would marry, and she always said this, if she found the man who she loved, who was her equal, who saw her as his equal, not out of this relationship where she had to yield her agency, but out of this relationship where two souls met and knew one another. So that's really what she wanted. And in her time, that was seen by most people as too much. And I think that's a huge part of why it was so refreshing for her to fall in with this crowd of thinkers like Emerson and Thoreau and the Alcotts, because this was maybe the first time in her life where her friends weren't telling her she was too much, where in fact they were enjoying sparring with her and debating with her and hearing what she had to say, because a lot of times it was seen as unseemly for a woman to have the talent and the brain power that she had.
Well, and as a result, that did impact how people saw her. And I even Googled her when I was done because I was so curious. And people had mixed thoughts about her, but I think of course they did because she was such a force. She was so ahead of her time. And so anytime someone like that is rocking the boat and is really charting a different course, there's going to be so much pushback.
Exactly. She was, as you said, charting a different course, and she was asking for more for women.
Thankfully.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate those people.
Exactly.
Well, I always love to talk about titles and covers. I think the cover on this one is stunning. Do you love it?
I love it. Thank you for saying that. I will say with a lot of my novels, there's been a lot of back and forth where it took a few tries to land on the right cover. We all weren't quite convinced until we landed, and we knew we'd met the cover. This was a first crack. We just saw this and we thought, this is Margaret Fuller. This is the cover.
I love it. And what about the title?
The title took me a little while because, as you said, she lived so many lives. She was such a force. She was such a big person. She lived such a big life. As you read the book, you will see the very first chapter, the prologue, gets into what this title means, Finding Margaret Fuller, and then it will run throughout. So I'm really happy with it. My most recent book prior to Margaret Fuller was The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post. And so these to me seem to dovetail and support and complement one another.
And the covers do as well. I actually
Yeah.
just bought that book recently to read it because I've heard so many great things about it. So it is up for me soon, and I can't wait to read it.
Thank you. I can't wait to hear what you think. Another great woman who changed history.
Exactly. And on that note, do you have a favorite of your books? I always ask that in a situation like yours where you've written so many. I'm curious.
It would be like having to pick a favorite child. I can't. No. You know what? My favorite is whatever is my most recent, because that is the one I'm obsessed with. That's the one I'm thinking about. That's the one I'm talking about. Each one is totally different. And how I arrived at the material is totally organic and different for each one. But I have to be obsessed with whichever one is the freshest, because I have to really love what I'm doing and what I'm researching and writing in order for that to come across as a story that I can then ask readers to read. So I have to say my most recent one, Finding Margaret Fuller, because that's really where my heart is right now. And I do think, I will be honest here, launches do not get easier for me. I think they get harder for me each time, because I think I get more and more sort of in my head, having internalized criticism and feedback and reviews. But I do think as a writer, you learn from each process. So I do feel like I'm able to build with each successive book. So, you evolve. You evolve as an artist. This will be my 10th book. So I've come a long way.
What about any of the women staying with you? I know for me, I love all sorts of books that I read, but there'll be certain books that just pop into my head more often. Are there any of the people you've written about that way, where all of a sudden Marjorie Post has just appeared to you again? I mean, is there one in particular that does that, or do they all just show up whenever they want?
Oh, well, they all have like free rent inside my head and show up all the time. But I would say I really do think about Marjorie all the time, because she was such a force and such a dynamic leader and such a decent, good person. I always say I want a bracelet that says, "What would Marjorie do?" Because I just really admire her. I think about Margaret a lot. Obviously, she's always on my mind. I think about Cece and just the power and the romance and the melancholy of her saga. I think about the Revolutionary War and Peggy Shipman all the time, because I live in the area where the trader's wife took place. So really all of them. And then I love my children's books. Nellie Takes New York and Poppy Takes Paris. I love children's books. It's a huge priority and goal of mine to write more children's books. So, I'm all over the place, Cindy. I'm all over the place.
But that's a good sign, because that means you've picked people that have stayed with you. So that's perfect.
And you know what? I should be so lucky that I pick people that I then have to talk about for the rest of my life, because it means people still want to read my work. So I hope I will be talking about these women for the rest of my life.
I'm sure you will be. Well, before we wrap up, Allison, what have you read recently that you really liked?
Yes, absolutely. So right now I'm reading Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt, which I'm just loving. I think it's so charming and creative and a bit quirky and just a little bit different. So I'm really enjoying that. Next up on my pile, I'm lucky I'm going to get to read the new Beatriz Williams, Husbands and Lovers. I love her sultry writing. So I'm looking forward to that. I also really loved, you mentioned Stephanie Dray. I'm a big Stephanie Dray fan. So I loved Frances Perkins. Talk about a woman that stays with you and you think about. I loved her Madam Secretary, Becoming Madam Secretary. Yeah, I read a lot of historical fiction, but I also really kind of am all over the place and read a lot of different genres. I'm looking forward to reading The Goddess of Warsaw by Lisa Barr coming up. I just finished Rochelle Weinstein's latest book, What You Do to Me. So I'm always reading. I'm always reading.
I'm always reading too. And I just love that, because there's always some great book that I can get lost in.
Exactly. There's a pile. As my grandmother said, she'll never be lonely as long as she has a book.
Exactly. The other thing I often say is that it is so easy to have a conversation with another book lover. Like, it takes 2 seconds. What have you been reading, or what have you loved? And then you're off and running. And, 2 hours later, you've now become fast friends. So I think that's the most wonderful thing about book lovers, is that you always have stuff to talk about.
Exactly. And there's always an instant connection. And, it's so subjective what we read, and everyone has different tastes. And that's awesome. And that's one thing I will say. That's why I don't get offended by reviews. Like, I don't get hurt by Amazon reviews of people who don't like my books, because I'm like, it's so subjective. Something that is a mega bestseller that everyone in the country loves. If I don't happen to like it, it's my opinion. And that's what's cool when you're talking to other readers. When the passion is there, everybody comes at it from a different perspective and everybody takes a different thing away from books. And so that's super fun to get into.
I think that's exactly right, because it can really matter where you are in your life. It also can matter what book you finish. Like if I finish this just absolutely amazing 5-star read that I will continue to think about, it's really hard to follow that up. So I think it can just totally vary by person, by time period, so many different factors.
Such a good point. Exactly. And also what I love, you can read the same book over and over and different points in your life. And whatever you're bringing to the experience, you're going to have a totally different takeaway. Like, I feel like The Great Gatsby is one of those books. I read The Great Gatsby pretty much every decade of my life because it's a totally different experience when you're reading The Great Gatsby as a high school student versus a college student versus a 20-something versus a 30-something and on and on. Those books that evolve and grow and change because they have that depth and that capacity there to sort of evolve. I love that too. I love revisiting an old favorite and seeing what new angle I'm going to find into the story.
I agree with that completely. I reread Pride and Prejudice and Persuasion maybe every 3 years, and I always find something different or something different resonates with me, or I think, oh, that never really stood out before. So yes, I think definitely as you age, different things resonate as well.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful thing with children's books too. I read a lot of children's books now because I'm a mother to 3, and I have a lot of the books that I read as a child, and now reading them as a mother, it's just wild and beautiful. Like I just read The Velveteen Rabbit the other night with my girls, and they were like, "Why are you crying so much?" It's like, you just, when you become a mother, it also changes how you read.
Oh, absolutely. My kids are much older. So when they were younger, I love that Blueberries for Sal, Make Way for Ducklings. And then as they made their way into chapter books. So absolutely, to be able to share those stories with them, it's just one of those things that it's a gift.
Start them young, right? Raise a reader, raise your readers.
Absolutely. And I did really well with my 2 daughters, not quite as well with my son, but I'm hoping he's going to eventually come around.
There you go. Exactly. There's always time.
Exactly. Well, Allison, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the Thoughts from a Page podcast. And I can't wait for everybody to read Finding Margaret Fuller.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Happy reading to everybody.
Absolutely.
History is complicated. The story of human progress is long, messy, and riddled with controversies big and small. On Conflicted, we dive headfirst into history's most infamous events and contentious figures. We try and untangle the good from the bad, the fact from the fiction, and the monsters from the misunderstood. Was Genghis Khan a murderous butcher or a civic pioneer? Did the Allied powers go too far in firebombing the German city of Dresden at the twilight of World War II? And how did the Marquis de Sade acquire such a sinister reputation? And was any of it true? These are just a few of the tough questions we wrestle with and investigate on Conflicted. So if you love history or just enjoy a good story, please join me, your host, Zach Cornwell, for a fascinating new topic each and every month. Conflicted, a history podcast, is available on Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you get your podcasts. I hope to see you soon.
Hello, and welcome to Novel Conversations, a podcast about the world's greatest stories. I'm your host, Frank Lavallo, and for each episode of Novel Conversations, I talk to 2 readers about one book. And together, we summarize the story for you. We introduce you to the characters, we tell you what happens to them, and we read from the book along the way. So if you love hearing a good story, you're in the right place. Our 9th season is coming this fall. Tune in to hear from some of the all-time great authors, Charles Dickens, Jules Verne, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and more. Subscribe to Novel Conversations wherever you listen to podcasts.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. I would love to connect with you on Instagram or Facebook, where you can find me at Thoughts from a Page. If you enjoy the show, please consider joining my Patreon group to access bonus content and support the podcast. If you have a moment to rate the show or subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcasts, I would really appreciate it. It makes a big difference. And please tell all of your friends about Thoughts from a Page. Word of mouth does wonders to help the show grow. The book discussed in this episode can be purchased at my bookshop storefront, and the link is in the show notes. I hope you'll tune in next time.
Hi, I'm Emma.
And I'm Joe.
And we're the Professional Book Nerds. 2 Mondays a month, we interview authors and talk about their upcoming books, what drives them, and their go-to order at the cafe.
On Thursdays, we share recommendations and dive into topics readers face, like how do I actually read the books on my to-be-read list?
You can find the Professional Book Nerds podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Want to learn more about us? Our website is professionalbooknerds.com, and you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at ProBookNerds.
We hope you'll come and listen, and as always, happy reading.
Don't you know that you're a grown-up?
I'm a grown-up.
Me too.
Yep, me too. But these days being a grown-up can really suck.
Luckily, we're grown-ups who grew up in the coolest generation.
We had video arcades.
And also some of the best TV and movies ever made.
We lived the origin of awesome consumer electronics. The list goes on and on.
Yep, Generation X.
Exactly.
And we're Gen X grown-up.
Every week, the Gen X Grown Up podcast explores media, tech, toys, games, and more from both yesterday and today.
Through the eyes of Generation Xers who absolutely love that stuff. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.
Or find us on our website, genxgrownup.com. All right, you think that was good enough?
I
hope so, man. I'm tired.
Who listens to a promo on a podcast and then goes and listens to a different podcast?
Right.
I've never done it.
No. Right.